So, good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Parke. I am an academic with a psychology background, interested in all things that relate to the psychology of gambling. Some of the main areas I'm interested in are the psychology of game design and how that relates to safer gambling behavior, gambling motivation, and various other areas. What I'd like to talk to you today about is to allow us to dip our toe into, if you like, the intersection of two key areas. One is product risk and what it is and what we know about it. And the second is academic gambling industry research collaboration and what that can tell us and how it can help make games less risky, how to make games more enjoyable, and how to remove the possibility of experiencing gambling-related harm. And then I'd like to finish off with just a few reflections. So Thomas Edison, when he invented the light bulb, he said that innovation was 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. In other words, having an idea or talking about doing something isn't anywhere near as important as actually executing it and making it meaningful. And of course, that's very true. And it's also something that often is a criticism that's leveled at the gambling industry. And so one of the aims of this presentation is to consider whether it's possible to use this type of collaboration for positive change, and also whether it can make some kind of meaningful contribution to both understanding product risk and hopefully trying to mitigate it. So to understand and to reduce harm, much like other areas in public health, it's essential to understand it by considering three groups of risk factors. So individual differences, and this includes, for example, biological vulnerability, motives, personality, everything from age to gender. I have the gambling environment, which can include the wider environments such as culture, advertising availability, and more localized issues, whether that be site accessibility and other things like that. And then thirdly, we have the product. So this is essentially the characteristics of games and platforms, and this is essentially what we're going to look at today. So what is product risk? Essentially, product risk refers to the propensity of a game and or its platform to contribute some form of harm to its consumer. So there are literally hundreds of structural characteristics that might influence that propensity. And here are some examples, some different characteristics and different categories of characteristics. What's important is while we know a little bit about some key areas, so for example, if we take game speed, we're relatively confident that the research tells us that fast continuous games can, on average, cost more per hour. They can facilitate mood modifications, so they're attractive to people who want to have avoidant coping. They can impair decision making. They can make self-control harder, and they're easier to chase losses on. But for example, what we don't know, and some of the knowledge gaps that exist, even with the better known areas of product risk, we need to make confident business and commercial regulatory decisions. So for example, how fast is too fast? If we're going to have a break and play, how long should a break and play be? After how long should a break and play be implemented? Are all fast games risky, or is it just certain configurations of product design that make a game potentially addictive? So while there are quite a lot of challenges, including, of course, the knowledge gaps that I was alluding to, it's not an impossible task. If we look to try to adopt a dual approach, it's not an impossible task if we look to try to develop a dual approach through collaboration. So firstly, if we can identify promising areas to take immediate regulatory and commercial action, and if we can adopt a long-term collaborative and strategic approach to trying to generate knowledge, then by doing those two things at the same time, we might be in a better position to mitigate product risk. However, one of the problems is the need for collaboration is pretty significant. So, for example, if you look at one of the key requirements is agreeing goals, and if you think of the variety of stakeholders that are involved in this debate, multiple stakeholders will have very different views and very different goals. So goals will vary across stakeholders. So it's important to get common ground for outcomes valued by all parties. So again, going back to the point about thresholds, who decides and how do we agree on what would represent a risky product and what would represent a product that wasn't risky and that would be acceptable? And so we also, if we're generating knowledge, we have to agree principles by which we collect the evidence. So are only certain groups deemed appropriate for collecting evidence? If a lot of work is done by one particular group to collect evidence, is that going to be taken seriously? Is it going to be sufficient for a burden of proof? So for all these reasons, there's a need for collaboration across a range of different stakeholders. It's important to recognize that industry is a key collaborator because they have an impact on both of these approaches that need to be done concurrently. Everything from game design policies, making changes where they can immediately, and doing research in terms of trial and evaluation. And they're a critical party to be involved in the theory of change, not least because it's the industry that has to try to make these changes and implement them, at least in terms of product risk. So I would suggest that collaboration with industry is not only meaningful, but it's essential. And it's essential for the reasons I just mentioned. So the scale of the task, the complexity of the task, the urgency with which it has to be done, and not to mention leveraging the various skills and experience and data that industry can provide. And as I say, ultimately, industry is effectively the ones that are going to have to implement those changes. So let's consider some examples. So one of these examples is looking at different ways through collaboration with industry. And all of these examples are collaboration examples that we have done with Kindred. So this first one we refer to as digital grounded theory. And if you think about how big data is being applied to understanding gambling behavior, to influencing gambling behavior, the best way to think about digital grounded theory is that instead of calling it big data, it's like looking at small data. It's using grounded theory, which is essentially systematically going through making observations that are grounded in the data, basically say what you see. In this example, we had 100 people who rated high on the problem gambling severity index. And not only did we want to look at what they said, either through interview or focus group, but actually the novel part of this approach is that we wanted to look at the data to look at what they actually do as well. Looking at the data, we can look at it second by second to have an idea of how the actual session of play transpires and what behavior comes before another behavior and what the consequences of a behavior is. You can see it in sequence and in context. And as I mentioned, we can also talk to players and get their thoughts, their feelings about these types of observations, get their explanation, and generally their cognitions about what was happening at the time that they were gambling, all of which to help to understand the phenomenon that much better. So not only in terms of doing novel research, one of the other benefits is that we have new insights and theories that can come out of this type of collaboration. And this is an example from this publication where we looked at casino behavior among those who are likely to be experiencing harm, and we noticed a trend. So one of the publications from this work provides a good example of how this type of collaboration can develop insights and new theories. And in this case, and I should say from the start that it's quite a busy diagram, and it's hard to see, but I'm going to simplify it. And anybody who's interested, you can have a look. We can provide the full publication so you can look at this in detail. But just at a very high level, if you look at the boxes, which we overlaid over the data, what this basically is casino behavior for one individual over a 24-hour period. And when we looked at the behavior, we noticed a variety of trends. And one of the most interesting trends was looking that after a period of escalating risk, increased deposits, increased stake size, multiple deposits, they win back some of the money. Then what happens? What follows that is a period of what we would refer to as protective behavior on the part of the player. So they withdraw some or all of their money. In most cases, they would withdraw most of the money. They might have a break in play. They reduce the size of their bet. And they switch the product sometimes to might be a lower risk product. However, one of the things that we noticed was that this window of behavior, if you like, was fairly brief. And if gambling continued past that point, then the risky behavior that escalated before the win would reemerge and the risk would continue. So what does that mean? So let me give you an example. So if we're getting preliminary insights about precise triggers for risk, we can do two things. We can understand it a bit better and we can take action. So based on the previous slide, we noticed that there was a gradual increase in risky behavior among some of those who scored high on the PGSI. And then if something happened, in this case, it was some financial recovery or even making a profit. If it happened during a session, we observed that financial harm was reduced, decision-making improved, intention to take risks had been reduced. And that kind of observations and those implications give some guidance about what kind of response operators can make. So ideally, there should be some kind of action to support players when you notice this behavior, particularly where there's immediate withdrawal of most of their money, which may be an indication that there's issues around affordability. So, for example, this might be a communication, it might be a break. But what should definitely not happen are actions to impede players' self-protective behaviors, particularly for the sake of profit. So, for example, during this period, if there's indication that the players are trying to reduce how much they're playing, it would be inappropriate to try to give bonuses to try to get the players back into action. And not to mention the legitimate possibility of supporting long-term business objectives by doing that kind of intervention. Everything from player retention to increasing customer satisfaction. And of course, one of the main areas where companies even now can develop a USP is in trying to build trust. Okay, so that was just one example. And just quickly finish with one other example. And in this case, something like reverse withdrawals is something that we had an idea that it probably isn't conducive to trying to play gambling in a safe way. But by doing this research, we can also get more context and more understanding and explanation for why that might be and what the players' views might be. So in this example from a different publication, we were able to look at different ways that players engage with reverse withdrawals. So, for example, how do they do it? How frequently do they do it? What are the triggers for a reverse withdrawal? But also, as I mentioned earlier, one of the other benefits is getting the player's own thoughts and feelings at the time, which gives that little bit of extra context to helping understand why it might be risky and how the harm or risk that comes from this particular feature might be mitigated. When we're talking about industry academic collaboration, one of the other things that's critically important is, and in many ways one of the most challenging components to it, is ensuring that when the research is done, it's not left sitting in a drawer. In other words, it's applied, it's being used, it's being considered. So, for example, in the case of this collaboration, we were pleased when regulators were using it to try to formulate strategy, when media were drawing it to the public's attention so that the findings could be disseminated. We were pleased to find out that Kindred themselves as a business had looked at the research, digested it, and taken a series of decisions to improve their safer gambling strategy as a result. I think one of the things that's important from a researcher's perspective is that our role as a researcher isn't to inform what we find. Our job as researchers are to try to do useful, valid, and reliable research. So in other words, our job is to inform. And so the critical point here is that for it to be meaningful, we need wider collaboration beyond just industry and academia, working in a silo. We need, where possible, and where the research justifies it, wider collaboration to look at the research to see if it's useful, and where appropriate, see how it can be applied, or at least how it might be trialed and evaluated. So on this last slide, I'd like to finish with some reflections about some of these issues. When I think of harm mitigation, and particularly in the context of product risk, I think of a 5,000-piece jigsaw. We already have a sufficient amount of the puzzle completed, and that gives us enough information to follow up on some promising areas for trying to mitigate risk. But there's still a considerable amount of areas that we don't know enough about. And almost with every component of game design, every structural characteristic, those examples I gave at the start of the presentation, there's still quite a lot that we don't know. And some of that information is critical in making key regulatory decisions. Because one of the things that we all want to avoid is making a decision that we're not sure about, and it may have unintended consequences in a variety of different ways that might not be what the intended aim was. And of course, academic industry collaboration can provide an important part of the jigsaw. And so one of the questions that quite often gets asked is, isn't this type of collaboration between industry and academics just designed to improve their reputation? And I guess the answer would be yes, of course, but you would hope that that would be just one of many outcomes. So it's not the right question to ask. The right question to ask would be, to what extent is the activities that they're talking about contributing to positive change? If they are contributing to positive change in a meaningful way, then this is something that they should be talking about, and they deserve credit for. Those who announce a piece of research, but then actually they never share it, they don't make it public, then it doesn't deserve credit, and it should be criticized. And increasingly, there are a lot of different examples of where meaningful work is being done, where new types of research can be carried out, new insights can be given, even on areas where we think we know everything about risk. For example, reverse withdrawals, it can add extra information that maybe improves understanding about why it's risky or what can be done to mitigate the risk. But I think the final point that I'd make is, while personally, certainly not in every case, but industry academic collaboration does have the potential to make a meaningful contribution. But one of the challenges is, if that research is siloed, if it's off, if they're off doing the research, and then other stakeholders aren't in a position or willing to collaborate to make use of that information, then ultimately progress will be slower. And I think that if the meaningful insights that are coming out of this research aren't being taken seriously, one of my concerns is that any incentive to do this type of research, where there's genuine interest to find stuff out and to make changes, if it's not valued by other stakeholders, or worse still, if it's outright criticized without even giving it a chance or reading it, then I fear it's going to stop, even though I think it makes a critical contribution to making gambling safer. And as I say, particularly in the context of what I think is one of the most complicated and contentious areas of gambling studies, product risk and its mitigation.